get those out before I need them. All right, so here we are, week 6. We're going to cover the rest of Ezra tonight, right? 8, 9, and 10. We'll have a little bit. Hopefully, we have time to get a little bit of recap in or summary rather at the back end, and then of course next week we'll take off on Nehemiah. Okay, let's start with quiz time. That's really small, isn't it? Can you read it? All right. So this first one, I'm using the text, the specific text, right? So it's a little bit different than what was presented in class. But how many people went to Jerusalem in the first return, not including the servants and singers? What's that? I hear you talking. Louder. Charlie? All right. That is correct. So if we look in chapter 2, verse 64, the total number, I think that first number there, the 7337, adds into that 42,000, and you come up with a number just a little bit shy of 50,000 people that went back in the first return, and that's going to become something we talk about in a few minutes. Okay, to which king did Tatnai write? Anybody? Who? What? Which letter? B. All right. That is correct. And how tall was? I'm sorry. That comes from chapter 5, verse 6. And how tall was the temple? Does anybody know what a cubit is? Okay. And what number? Or what letter? C. 60 cubits. 60 cubits. I found it odd in the dimensionality of that. It says how wide it is and how tall it is, but it doesn't say how deep it is. That comes from chapter 6, verse 3. All right, last question. The temple was completed on the 3rd day of what month? I gave you the whole calendar because, there you go. Adar. Awesome. So that's from chapter 6, verse 15. And what's the weird thing about Adar? Some leap years, like every 7th year or so, you can have 2 months of Adar. All right, good work. So the first 14 verses of chapter 8, it's a genealogy of everybody that Ezra recruits. So in chapter 7, he's given permission, I guess, an edict, maybe another way to say that, to gather up people, volunteers, anybody that wants to go back. And in the beginning part of the chapter 8, he lists out their heritage, who they are. And, it's very important to the Jewish people to be able to trace their lineage back. And we're going to kind of not read those names. So, but added it up, and the numbers that are mentioned there come up to about 1,754 men, right? So if you take 1,754 against the 49,000 or so that are numbered in the first return, you kind of get the idea that this second Exodus, if you will, is a lot smaller than the original one, right? So let's read starting in chapter 8, verse 15. I gathered them to the river that runs to Ahava, and there we camped 3 days. As I reviewed the people and the priests, I found there none of the sons of Levi. Then I sent for Eleazar, Ariel, Shemaiah, Elnathan, Jerib, Nathan, Zechariah, and Meshullam, leading men, and for Jeriab and Elnathah, who were men of insight, and sent them to Iddo, the leading man at a place Casaphia, telling them what to say to Iddo and his brothers and the temple servants at the place Casaphia, namely to send us ministers for the house of our God. And by the good hand of our God on us, they brought us a man of discretion of the sons of Malai, the son of Levi, the son of Israel, namely Sherebiah, with his sons and kinsmen, there were 18 of them, also Hashabiah, and with him Jeshishiah of the sons of Merari, with his kinsmen and their sons 20, besides 220 of the temple servants whom David and his officials had set apart to attend the Levites. These were all mentioned by name. So this river Ava, right? You know how we've been kind of trying to place things geographically. Unfortunately, this one is a little bit lost. I can't show you on a map. This is what they're talking about. But it's probably not that terribly important. But what is important is, why are there no Levites in the group? And why is Ezra concerned about that? Mark?
Because Ezra's going to return temple worship. His duty or his role is to go back and restore temple worship. And you can't restore temple worship without priest. And in order to be a priest, you have to be a descendant of Levi.
That's correct. Right. So we need Levites to have a complete return and to fulfill the mission that Ezra is going on to restore temple worship, right? There's one piece of this that's maybe not 100% clear. If you look in Malachi 2, I was hoping Keith would be here tonight because of his last quarter's class, but in Malachi 2, you can see that the priesthood and the Levites in general are really struggling at this point in time. There's a lot of sin, criminality even amongst this group. So in the first return, there was a very slim number relative to the whole, and here again, we're going to come up with basically 38, right? So they go off to this guy Iddo, the leading man of Casaphia, which I have a feeling that's kind of testable, quizzable material, right? If we're taking notes about what we're going to quiz on. So this Iddo guy sends 38 men, and it's a little unclear to me also as to whether the 220 temple servants, now these are not Levites, these were people that are said David assigned them to serve the Levites, to be assistants to the Levites. I'm not sure if they were, this 220 came from Iddo or if they were in the original group, but that's probably inconsequential, really. Okay. Let's read 8:21 and 23. Then I proclaimed a fast there at the river Ahava, that we might humble ourselves before our God, to seek from him a safe journey for ourselves, our children, and all our goods. For I was ashamed to ask the king for a band of soldiers and horsemen to protect us against the enemy on our way. Since we had told the king, the hand of our God is good on all who seek him, and the power of his wrath is against all who forsake him. So we fasted and implored our God for this, and he listened to our entreaty. Right? So Ezra gathers up this group of folks, and he's got them at the river. Now he's pulled in his Levites, and he says, all right, guys, I got bad news. I don't have any soldiers to protect all of this stuff. We're going to talk about all the stuff. There's a lot of stuff that they're taking back, all these gold and silver things, right? So we're going to have prayer and fasting in order to ask God to protect us on our journey, right? But it says, since we had told the king, the hand of our God is for good on all who seek him, and the power of his wrath is against all who forsake him. Was that true? Is that statement true? Man, y'all are quiet. Charles is shaking his head, yes. Right? That's a true statement, right? But why was he embarrassed to ask the king about it? What's that?
He had said that, our God will take care of whatever, it will take care of us, but, oh, by the way, can you throw in some soldiers? That doesn't work
It's
together.
a little dichotomous,
Yeah.
right? He may have also kind of said to the king, our God is really powerful. You want to watch out for getting cross with him, right? So he's made a case to get these people out, to get them back to Jerusalem that involves a relationship of this king and God, right? So how do we rationalize, maybe a bad word, but how do we mesh together the idea that, I'm sorry, you guys might like to see those quotes. How do we mesh together this idea that God is for the people who worship him and against those that are against him, and still have security detail or whatever? How do we mesh this together? If you had to explain this to Darius, how would you, or Artaxerxes, how would you explain this? So quiet. Tell you what, Rocky. I'm sorry, Matt, what?
I don't really understand the question.
So what I'm asking is, if you had to explain to the king how it can be true that God, the hand of God is for good on those that do his will and against those that don't, but I still need a detachment of soldiers, how would you explain that?
It'd be hard.
What's that?
It'd be hard to explain.
I don't think so. Rocky, you had your hand up.
I don't think he's saying at all that we don't have any security. We don't have men who can fight if we're attacked. But he's not going to place he's not wanting to place his reliance on security on a pagan king. He's going to place his reliance on security on God. And I think if you're trying to compare that to today, then that's the same thing. I mean, this is obviously a physical situation, but it has spiritual counterparts, because he knew God wanted the temple to be rebuilt. He knew God wanted people to go back to the land, to their original land and rebuild Jerusalem. So God was in favor of all of that happening. So it's kind of, if God is for us, who can be against us? It's kind of that line of thinking.
And you're correct. However, he does say he was embarrassed to ask. And he's going to set up a security system. He wanted those soldiers, right? I think the way you explain that is it's about the time frame, right? You've got an earthly time frame that says, I'm going to take these things over there, I'd like a security detail. You've got a heavenly time frame that says God's hand is against those that are against God, right? So it's not necessarily that God is going to strike them down, right? Even with a band of soldiers, they could have still been attacked by a larger or a better band of soldiers and lost all of this stuff, right? At least in this dispensation, God wouldn't necessarily strike them down, right? So I think what if I had to explain that to the king, my argument would be that this is about time frames, and we're working in a completely different set than what God works in. It's a little bit what you touched on Wednesday, Keaton, right? That we're not always on the plan that God has for us, right? I also think it's interesting, and maybe as they're praying and they're fasting and they're asking God to protect them, I wonder, is Ezra kind of reminding God or thinking about how Moses, right, when the people are rebelling and God says he's going to strike them all dead and start over, and Moses reminds God that, hey, your reputation is a little bit on the line here as well, right? So you see that Exodus 32:12. But let's go ahead and look at chapter 8, verse 24. Then I set apart 12 of the leading priests, Sherebiah, Hashabiah, and 10 of their kinsmen with them, and I weighed out to them the silver and the gold and the vessels, the offering for the house of our God, that the king and his counselors and his lords and all Israel were present had offered. I weighed out into their hands 650 talents of silver and silver vessels worth 200 talents and 100 talents of gold, 20 bowls of gold worth 1,000 derricks, and 2 vessels of fine bright bronze, as precious as gold. And I said to them, you are holy to the Lord, and the vessels are holy, and the silver and the gold are the freewill offering to the Lord, the God of your fathers. Guard them and keep them until you weigh them before the chief priests and the Levites and the heads of the fathers' houses in Israel at Jerusalem, within the chambers of the house of the Lord. So the priests and the Levites took the weight of the silver and the gold and the vessels to bring them to Jerusalem to the house of our God. Then we departed from the river Ahava on the 12th day of the first month to go to Jerusalem. The hand of our God was on us, and he delivered us from the hand of the enemy and the ambushes by the way. We came to Jerusalem, and there we remained 3 days. On the 4th day, within the house of our God, the silver and the gold and the vessels were weighed into the hands of Meremoth the priest, son of Uriah, and with him was Eleazar the son of Phinehas, and with them were the Levites, Jozabad the son of Jeshua, and Noadiah the son of Binnui. The whole was counted and weighed, and the weight of everything was recorded. At that time, those who had come from the captivity, the returned exiles, offered burnt offerings to the God of Israel, 12 bulls for all Israel, 96 rams, 77 lambs, and a sin offering, 12 male goats. All this was burnt offering to the Lord. They also delivered the king's commissions to the king's satraps and to the governors of the province beyond the river, and they aided the people in the house of God. So Ezra, without the military detachment that he would like to have had, he picks the 12 priests to be the guard of all of these free will offerings. It's interesting to me that the sort of 2 leaders of those that he picks are the same 2 patriarchs that are sent to him by Iddo, right? So these are the senior guys, and they're going to be the guard, right? So I can misspell publicly there. They weighed out all of this stuff to the priest, and they did that in public, right in front of everybody, right? And I think there's a element of keeping them honest, right? But there's also an element that we can think about. It's setting an expectation, right? Everybody knows what your job is. And he says to them, you are holy and the vessels are holy, right? So he's in front of everybody giving them a certain set of responsibility and maybe a feeling of enthusiasm about what it is they're doing, a reason to do that, right? So after they've been at the river for about 12 days, and they head on out, and they get to Jerusalem. It says they waited 3 days, and on the 4th day they go up and they count all of this stuff back to the temple priests. I thought it was interesting, the very last verse of the chapter, it says that they delivered the king's commissions to the governors and the satraps, right? That is most likely the letter that we saw from Artaxerxes back in chapter 7, verse 21. All right, so let's move on to Ezra 9. Yep.
Doesn't verse 31 address what we just talked about a few minutes ago? It says the hand of our God was upon us. So either God providentially looked after them when they wasn't attacked, or if they were attacked, God
Yeah, Rocky, I don't deny that God protected them. I don't deny that he was willing and accepting and wanting God's protection. But he wanted the military. But he didn't feel like he could ask for it because of what he had already said to the king about God's power will protect us. So he had to kind of live up to his own words, right? So he put it out there. Now he's got to live by it. All right, chapter 9. So after these things had been done, the officials approached me and said, "The people of Israel and the priests and the Levites have not separated themselves from the people of the lands with their abominations, from the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Jebusites, the Ammonites, the Moabites, the Egyptians, and the Amorites. For they have taken some of their daughters to be wives for themselves and for their sons, so that the holy race has mixed itself with the peoples of the lands. And in this faithlessness, the hand of the officials and chief men has been foremost." As soon as I heard this, I tore my garment and my cloak and pulled hair from my head and beard and sat appalled. All right. So there's a lot of commentary about the sections that we're getting ready to go into. And I think there's some pretty dubious timelines that are out there, and some of that comes from names being the same name but different guy, and some of it I think is just a wish or a desire to have a timeline to fit a narrative. But they use this returned exiles, and they apply that to this group of people who have very recently arrived in Jerusalem, right? It's possible that this is a little bit longer, but the text kind of points that this is about a week that these guys have been in Jerusalem, right? So who's coming to Ezra? It's the people that have been in Jerusalem from Zerubbabel's return, and it's all caps in my notes here. My opinion that this isn't about exclusively the people that have come back with Ezra. This is probably likely about the people who have been there, who returned with Zerubbabel, right? Because, where we're going with this is marriages and children, and these guys that just got back from Babylon, they may be quick, but that seems a little too fast to me, okay? It's also interesting that the leadership here are the ones that are said to have the biggest problem with this intermarriage. And you can see that Ezra, he's taken aback by this, right? So he's left Babylon, and you can kind of imagine he's got this letter from the king, and it says that Jerusalem is restored and we're going to be a nation again because, look, we can enforce our laws and I'm going to be in charge, and it's exciting, and they have the journey, right? And they get there, and all of a sudden somebody says, "Oh, you got to hear about this." And it says in verse 4, I think it is, that he sits there until evening time appalled. He's just shocked by this behavior. It's out of character with God's wishes, and he doesn't necessarily know that this isn't the end of Israel, right? That God may just cut him off, right? So let's look at his call. He goes to the people, and he calls them back to repentance. So let's look in chapter 9, verse 5 through 15. And at the evening sacrifice, I rose from my fasting and closed my Bible app. Sorry. And at the evening sacrifice, I rose from my fasting with my garment and my cloak torn, and fell upon my knees and spread out my hands to the Lord my God, saying, "O my God, I am ashamed and blush to lift my face to you, my God, for our iniquities have risen higher than our heads, and our guilt has mounted up to the heavens. From the days of our fathers to this day, we have been in great guilt, and for our iniquities, we, our kings and our priests, have been given into the hand of the kings of the lands, to the sword, to captivity, to plundering, and to utter shame as it is today. But now, for a brief moment, favor has been shown by the Lord our God to leave us a remnant and to give us a secure hold within his holy place, that our God may brighten our eyes and grant us a little reviving in our slavery, for we are slaves. Yet our God has not forsaken us in our slavery, but has extended to us his steadfast love before the kings of Persia to grant us some reviving, to set up the house of our God, to repair its ruins, and to give us protection in Judea and Jerusalem. And now, our God, what shall we say after this? For we have forsaken your commandments, which you commanded by your servants the prophets, saying, the land that you are entering to take possession of, it is a land impure with the impunity of the peoples of the lands, with their abominations that have filled it from end to end with their uncleanness. Therefore do not give your daughters to their sons, neither take their daughters for your sons, and never seek their peace or prosperity, that you may be strong and eat the good of the land, and leave it for an inheritance to your children forever. And after all that has come upon us for our evil deeds and our great guilt, seeing that you, our God, have punished us less than our iniquities deserved, and have given us such a remnant as this, shall we break your commandments again and intermarry with the peoples who practice these abominations? Would you not be angry with us until you consumed us, so that there should be no remnant nor any to escape? O Lord, the God of Israel, you are just, for we left a remnant that has escaped as it is today. Behold, we are before you in our guilt, and none can stand before you because of this. So you see Ezra, and he's in a physical state, right? And he's prostrating himself in front of the people. So this is the top man. This is the president, the leader, right? And here he's just kind of losing his mind about this, right? And I think that his complete commitment to this, he didn't necessarily need to repent, but this idea of repentance for the nation, it seems like that's compelling, right, to the people, and they're going to come over with him. Verses 8 and 9 I find particularly poignant, right, because he's talking about how it's an exceptional moment, right, that this sort of foreign king has let them go out of his own goodwill, his graciousness, right? Obviously, God's moved his heart, and it's almost like snatching defeat out of the jaws of victory in Ezra's mind, right? Like they were so close, and now they're showing so much ingratitude to God for that. Rocky?
I think there's a little more to it. In Deuteronomy chapter 7, verses 1 through 4, he lists all these countries of people that they weren't to intermarry with, and he gives a reason why: because they will turn you away from me to other gods. Why had they been in Babylonian captivity? Because of idolatry. So they were doing the very same thing that got them into that fix in the first place, and that's why he's so upset, because he's saying, you haven't learned.
Exactly.
Idolatry is wrong. You haven't learned. You're doing exactly what God told you not to do. You're marrying these people, and they're going to turn you right back to idolatry, and what's going to happen to you?
Yeah, and you see in verse 11 and 12, he specifically tells them that. This is what God told you not to do, right?
That's why. The marriages were wrong. It was sinful for them to be married to those people.
Yeah. So let's look at chapter 10, verse 1. While Ezra prayed and made confession, weeping and casting himself down before the house of God, a very great assembly of men, women, and children gathered to him out of Israel. For the people wept bitterly, and Shechaniah the son of Jethiel, the sons of Elam, addressed Ezra. We have broken faith with our God and have married foreign women from the peoples of the land, but even now there is hope for Israel in spite of this. Therefore, let us make a covenant with our God to put away all these wives and their children, according to the counsel of my Lord and of those who tremble at the commandment of our God, and let it be done. According to the law, arise, for it is your task, and we are with you. Be strong and do it. Then Ezra arose and made the leading priests and Levites and all Israel take an oath that they would do as had been said. So they took the oath. Then Ezra withdrew from before the house of God and went to the chamber of Jehohanan, the son of Eliashib, where he spent the night, neither eating bread nor drinking water, for he was mourning over the faithlessness of the exiles. And a proclamation was made throughout Judah and Jerusalem to all the returned exiles that they should assemble at Jerusalem, and that if anyone did not come within 3 days by order of the officials and the elders, all his property would be forfeited, and he himself banned from the congregation of the exiles. Then all the men of Judah and Benjamin assembled at Jerusalem within the 3 days. It was the 9th month, on the 20th day of the month, and all the people sat in the open square before the house of God, trembling because of this matter and because of the heavy rain. So we have a fellow that comes forward, Shechaniah. Remember that, right? And he confesses. And it's a corporate confession. He offers the solution. We got to put these women and their children out. And he points out to Ezra, you've got the edict of the king. You are the man that can enforce the law. It says so right there in that letter from Artaxerxes. So make it happen, right? And he tells them that the people are going to support what he does, right? So as a leader, it's always nice to know that the people are going to follow with you and they're not going to rebel. So we're getting a little tight on time, so we're going to kind of speed up a little bit. So Ezra gets these leaders and he says, okay, you guys have to swear an oath that you're going to do this thing. He sends them all away, and then he spends the night in prayer and fasting. And they send out a letter to everybody that they need to assemble in Jerusalem. They give them 3 days to get there. And it's interesting that the attendance is mandatory for this meeting. If you don't show up, you are kicked out of Israel. You're out of the camp. And they're taking all your stuff before they kick you out, right? So you go, your stuff stays. They mentioned the rain. There's some guys that say, hey, this is a big deal. We can't just resolve this here today because it's raining and there's a lot of the stuff to go through, right? It's not just raining today, right? This is a rainy season. They're going to be roughly December time frame, based on the months that it shows here in the text. And they come up with this idea that they're going to, as I said here, decentralize this process. So everybody goes back to their town, elders are appointed, and they start looking through the people. Who has a foreign wife? Who's done this thing, right? There were a couple of guys that said they didn't like the idea. They got voted down. The whole process takes about 3 months for all of the men to have, all of these people to have been reviewed and come up with a list of who had married foreign wives, right? I really wish we had more time to dig into this because it's a pretty meaty section. We may come back and talk about it next week. But interesting that in verse 10:14 kind of reminded me as Ezra is sending these guys out to judge the men of their towns. It's like Moses gets the advice from his father-in-law to set up judges of the people. So rather than trying to handle it all in one spot, we're going to spread the load, right? In the end, what you end up with is about 112 men that have a foreign wife, right? And those 112 marriages are dissolved, and that's the end of the book. We don't really know what happened to the women and children. There's no recording or there's just no capacity in Jewish law for what happens when you put out a foreign wife, because you were never supposed to have a foreign wife to begin with, right? So, Harry, last comment, because we're out of time.
It's just really kind of interesting that God didn't really speak to Ezra on this part. It was just a bunch of guys talking, because in Deuteronomy, as Rocky yourself pointed out, and the scripture pointed out, we weren't supposed to do it anyway. But in Malachi chapter 2 says that God hates divorce. And don't deal treacherously with your wives of your youth. So maybe they should have spent more time in the scripture and some wiser counsel. I don't know, but it seems a little odd that they went with, we're going to, I don't know, divorce.
Well, it certainly seems odd to us from a modern sort of standpoint. So,
I disagree with that. If you go to Numbers chapter 25, what's going on is the children of Israel are about to go into the promised land. And they pass by Moab. And Balak, who's the leader of Moab, is afraid of them. And so he calls on Balaam, who's a prophet of God, to curse him. He takes him up to the mountain of Peor 3 times. And then he keeps blessing Israel. So finally he says, like, come on, I'm going to give you a bunch of money. And so Balaam tells him, here's how you destroy Israel. You get them to intermarry with Moab. So they did. And there was a big plague that God brought upon the Israelites. 24,000 died. You can read about it in Numbers chapter 25. And Phinehas, who was the priest, catches one of them and stabs them both through with the spear. Because he was zealous for God. This was in the law that Rocky just mentioned. And the reason is because God is a holy God. Be holy as I am holy.
and he's preserving his holy people to himself. So that's why this was done. But what I'm saying is there's no tenet in God's law that says this is how you put out a foreign wife, because they were never supposed to have one to begin with, right?
I need to have one thought here. As you said, there was no scriptural, it was unlawful for them to be married to those women in the first place. So why did they have to put them away? Because that's why. They had no scriptural authority to be married.
Yep.
And so that's the lesson we need to learn today, because even today, people can be divorced and remarried for unscriptural causes, not because they're married to someone of a different nationality, but because they're married to somebody they're not scripturally entitled to be married to. And the only solution to that is to get out of that unlawful marriage. And that's what they had to do. Now, as you say, he doesn't give us any of the details, certainly because God is a righteous God. Even in sin, we're responsible for our actions. So it is beyond me that they would have just abandoned those women and not provided some kind of financial support or something for them and for their kids, because they fathered them. But they couldn't remain in that marriage relationship because it was unlawful for them to do so. And that was the only way of getting out of it. You couldn't just say, I'm sorry, God, and then stay in that unscriptural relationship. They couldn't do that. They had to get out of it. And that's why the solution was so hard, because that was the only way of pleasing God, was to get out of a marriage they weren't entitled to in the first place.
That's correct. Okay, we're done.